Hi there, I'm a historian. If you're having trouble sleeping tonight, I think my story might just help you drift off. For now, all you need to do is close your eyes. And if you have headphones nearby, go ahead and put them on. Let my voice and the sound of rain carry you gently into sleep. Now then, let's begin. The factory whistle hasn't blown yet, but Mary is already awake. It's 4:20 a.m. in the heart of Manchester. The streets are cold and damp, the kind of damp that seeps through brick cloth and bone. Outside, a thick fog hangs in the air like ghostly curtains, barely lit by flickering gas lamps. Inside the small one-room home she shares with her mother and 3 siblings, Mary lies stiff on a straw-stuffed mattress. Her thin blanket offers no warmth. Her body aches from yesterday's labor, but rest is a luxury she cannot afford. Work doesn't wait. She sits up and quietly swings her legs over the edge of the bed. The floor is cold stone. She shivers, but there's no time to complain. She gently nudges her younger sister to the side and moves carefully to avoid waking the baby. Every sound feels too loud in this silence before dawn. Her mother, half asleep, murmurs a blessing that's more instinct than intention. No light fills the room except for the tiny flame of a stubby candle. Mary reaches for her dress, plain worn gray. She's worn it every day for the last year. The fabric is rough from repeated washing in cold water, and the seams are beginning to give. Her hair, once thick and golden, is now tied tightly back in a bun to keep it away from the machines. A girl with loose hair near spinning frames is a dead girl. She washes her face with what's left of yesterday's water in a cracked ceramic bowl. It's icy. The shock wakes her up. There is no soap. There hasn't been for weeks. Her teeth are never brushed. Hygiene is a forgotten dream like school or fresh eggs. Her breakfast is a piece of hard bread half the size of her hand. She chews it slowly to make it last. There is no butter, no jam, no tea. Only silence fog and the echo of a city still sleeping. At 4:45 a.m., she steps outside. The city is beginning to stir, not with joy, but with dread. Other children and young women join her in the alley, all headed in the same direction, the cotton mill. Most don't speak. What's there to say? The air outside is thick with soot and smoke. Coal fires burn in the distance, belching black clouds into the air. Somewhere a dog barks and somewhere else a baby cries. The factory looms ahead like a castle from a nightmare, 5 stories tall with hundreds of windows that barely let in light. The brick is permanently stained from years of smoke. Iron gates surround the yard like a prison. The air smells of grease dust and misery. At exactly 5:00 a.m., the factory whistle pierces the dawn. The sound is brutal, sharp metallic and impossible to ignore. It signals the start of a 14-hour shift. Those not already inside will soon find the gates locked. If you're late, you're out. If you're out, you're hungry. Mary joins the flood of bodies through the doors. The temperature inside the factory is sweltering, deliberately so. Cotton breaks less in humidity, so the overseers keep the rooms hot and wet even in winter. Steam hisses from pipes, gears grind metal against metal, and the endless thump of machinery drowns out everything. This is Mary's world. Her job is to be a piecer. It sounds gentle, but it's not. She works next to huge spinning frames, moving at dangerous speeds. Her task is to watch for broken threads and tie them back together while the machines are running. She must lean in fast and fearless while the spinning continues. One slip 1 second too slow, and she could lose a finger, or a hand, or more. She shares her section with dozens of others, mostly girls between 10 and 16. Some are even younger. The youngest worker Mary knows is just 6. He's a scavenger crawling under moving machines with a brush to clear out lint and debris before it builds into fire hazards. The machines don't stop for him. No one does. There is no conversation. The roar of machinery makes talking impossible. The only communication is through gestures and glances. Mary and her friend Alice sometimes share a quick smile during shift changes, but not today. Alice's hand is wrapped in cloth. She caught it on a bobbin yesterday. It's still bleeding. By 7:00 a.m., the overseer arrives, Mr. Griggs, a tall, bitter man with sharp eyes and a cane that never leaves his side. He watches like a hawk. If someone slows down or looks away for too long or dares to pause for a moment, he punishes them. He doesn't speak much, just the sound of his cane slamming against wood or flesh. The scars on Mary's calves remind her to never let her mind wander. Her hands move fast now, automatically. Grab the thread. Knot it. Don't fall behind. Don't blink. Don't bleed. There is no break until noon. 6 hours of labor before a single chance to stop. Her feet ache. Her back is sore. Her fingers are dry and cracked. Tiny cuts line her hands where the thread has snapped. Her stomach is hollow and her head is light. But the work doesn't end. It never ends. Not in this place. By the time the factory bell clangs at noon, Mary feels like her body belongs to someone else. Her muscles move, but she no longer controls them. Only the rhythm of the machines commands her. Her legs ache from standing still for 7 hours, and her fingers feel as if they've been chewed by dogs. Every joint in her hands is swollen. Her skin itches from cotton dust, and her mouth is dry from the hot air. The bell doesn't bring excitement, just relief. Brief, temporary relief. Workers don't leave the factory for lunch. They sit down wherever there's space on crates against walls, or even the factory floor if it's not too slick with oil. Mary moves toward the cracked window, where through the smoke-streaked glass she can see a patch of pale gray sky. It's the only moment in the day when she can remember there's a world outside. She pulls a tiny cloth bundle from her dress pocket. Inside is a piece of bread and a few crumbs of cheese. She eats slowly, chewing each bite like it might be her last. Some girls have nothing to eat at all. Alice, sitting next to her with her injured hand, has only water. Her family couldn't afford food that week. She dips a finger in the cup and presses it to her lips. Her bandages are stained red, but she says nothing. There's no talking. The girls are too tired. There's no laughing, no joy. Only chewing and breathing, and hoping the next half doesn't feel like dying. Near the far end of the floor, a young boy vomits from the heat and collapses. He's dragged away by 2 older workers and left near the doorway until he either wakes up or doesn't. The overseer doesn't even turn his head. After exactly 30 minutes, the bell rings again. No warning, no mercy. Mary stands. Her back pops from being hunched over. She ties her apron tighter and returns to her machine. The heat is worse now. Midday steam fills the room, and the floor feels like it's sweating beneath her feet. The second half of the day is always harder. Morning brings fatigue. Afternoon brings pain. The air grows thicker with dust, and the smell of oil and sweat mixes into something sickening. No windows are opened. The spinning frames demand humidity. Fresh air is the enemy of efficiency. Mary's job doesn't change, but her ability to do it begins to fade. Her eyes blur. Her arms feel like stone. Every time a thread breaks, she has to lean in close enough to feel the machine's breath tie it with trembling fingers and pull back before the rollers snap her wrist. At 2:15 p.m., she sees someone fall. It's a girl named June. 13 years old fast with her hands, but too small for the larger machines. She slips while reaching for a jammed thread. Her dress catches on the belt. In one horrible second, the machine pulls her forward. Her scream is short. Then there's blood. A lot of it. The machines stop only for a moment long enough to remove her body. No one speaks. No one is allowed to. Mary turns her face away, forces her mind to go blank. She cannot think. She cannot cry. She cannot ask why. There is only the machine and the rhythm and the next thread to tie. They're told the machines break down less often now, thanks to better maintenance. But better for who? Not for the children crawling under them. Not for the girls losing fingers or scalps when a loose hair gets caught. And not for Mary, whose fingertips are cracked open and stained dark from weeks of oil and blood. The overseer walks by again. His cane taps the floor each step like a drumbeat of judgment. He pauses beside a boy who's working slower than usual. The boy's eyes are red. He's limping. Mr. Griggs lifts the cane without a word and slams it down across the boy's shoulders. The boy doesn't scream. He just lowers his head and speeds up. That's what the factory does. It teaches you silence. At 500 p.m., the whistle blows again. But it's not the end. Not for everyone. Some shifts run until 7 Zoncha or even 9 Zoncha. Today, Mary is fortunate. She only has to stay until 6. She's already been working 13 hours. One more to go. She doesn't count minutes anymore. She counts tasks. 5 more threads. 2 more bobbins. 1 last sweep. Finally, as the gears slow and the spinning frames hiss to a stop, Mary steps back. Her whole body buzzes with exhaustion. Her hands are numb. Her eyes sting. Her mouth is coated in dust. She removes her apron and folds it carefully. It's the only one she owns. Outside, the sky is already dark. The fog has returned, mixing with the soot from 100 chimneys. The streets are alive again, but not with music or joy. Just footsteps. Heavy, tired, defeated. She walks home in silence with Alice. No energy left for conversation. Their hands are bandaged. Their backs are bent. Their childhoods, if they ever had them, are long gone. They pass a group of boys laughing, not factory workers, but sons of merchants or clerks. Boys with shoes that fit and hands without scars. They don't look at the girls. The girls don't look back. Mary reaches her door. Her mother is there, waiting with a candle. The baby is asleep. The room is cold. Dinner is watery soup and 1 piece of potato. She eats without speaking. She lies on the mattress. She stares at the ceiling. She closes her eyes. The day is over, but only for a few hours, because tomorrow the whistle will blow again at 5:00 a.m., and the machines will call her back. Morning comes again, not with light, but with sound. That same terrible whistle, slicing through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. It doesn't just wake people, it commands them. Mary stirs not fully rested, because rest in her world is never complete. Her back still throbs from yesterday. Her hands are wrapped in cloth, and 1 eye won't stop twitching. But there's no question of staying home. Sick days don't exist in the mill. If she doesn't show up, her wages are docked. If she misses too many days, she's replaced. There's always someone hungrier waiting outside the gates. Her mother has been coughing again, a deep rattling cough that doesn't go away. It's just the coal smoke, she says. It'll pass, but Mary knows it won't. Every family on the street has someone who coughs like that until one day they don't wake up at all. At the mill, things are no better. They never are. The machines are louder today. Some say the engines were repaired. Others say they're just breaking down more. Either way, the room feels more dangerous. The gears are faster. The heat more intense. And the dust. It's everywhere, clinging to the skin, coating the throat, settling in the lungs like a slow poison. By noon, a boy named James collapses near the looms. He's only 11. No one knows what's wrong. He just dropped. Pale. Sweating. Barely breathing. They carry him to the yard and leave him under the stairs. Mary watches from across the room, but she's learned not to react. Reactions get noticed, and when Mr. Griggs notices, pain follows. This is the other truth about factory life. The machines aren't the only thing that can break you. Some of the older girls, 17, 18, walk with limps. Their backs curve unnaturally. One girl has a twisted arm mangled by a belt last year. The factory let her return only because her other arm still works. Another Eliza used to sing softly during breaks. She hasn't spoken in months. Her sister says she sometimes forgets where she is, just stares at the wall, even when she's home. And it's not just injuries. The air itself is deadly. The constant inhalation of cotton fibers leads to something the doctors call mill lung, a kind of slow suffocation. You don't notice it at first. Then one day, you can't climb stairs without gasping. Then you can't walk across a room. Then you can't get out of bed. No one in the mill reaches old age. No one even expects to. The lucky ones die young. The unlucky ones keep working year after year until their bodies can't go on. Then they're discarded like worn-out tools. Mary doesn't speak of these things. No one does. They are facts too heavy to carry in daylight. And yet, even in this gray world, rumors begin to spread. Quiet voices whispered during stolen breaks speak of change. A man named Owen, who built a factory where workers are treated fairly. A woman in London campaigning for laws to protect child laborers. A priest writing to Parliament. It all sounds like fantasy. Like another kind of dream, the kind people in Mary's world are told to forget. But some of them don't forget. It starts with a broken machine. A spinning frame on the third floor jams without warning. The belt snaps and the gears scream like animals. A shower of sparks rains down on the wood floor. Workers scream. Someone pulls the emergency lever. The engine groans and stops. For the first time in months, the factory falls silent. Then something strange happens. No one moves. Mary stands frozen, her hands trembling, heart pounding. She expects Mr. Griggs to appear instantly shouting, swinging that cane. But he doesn't. He's somewhere else. And in that moment of silence, a voice rises. It's Alice. Her voice is raw, but clear. We shouldn't be here. A few heads turn. Most still stare straight ahead. Alice steps forward. That boy yesterday, James, he died. No one said anything. No one stopped. We just kept working. Mary's stomach turns. It's true. She saw it. They all did. Then another girl, Eliza, the one who never spoke, murmurs. I dream of air. Just once. Clean air. The silence cracks. Like a thread pulled too tight. It's not a revolt. Not yet. But it's something. A shared glance. A tear. A breath held longer than usual. A whisper that maybe just maybe things don't have to be this way. Mr. Griggs finally arrives, red-faced and furious. He threatens. He yells. He cracks his cane on the wall. But something has shifted. The fear is still there, but now there's something underneath it. Something deeper. Anger. Exhaustion. The beginnings of defiance. Mary doesn't say anything that day. But that night, lying in her bed, listening to her mother cough, she thinks about what Alice said. She dreams of a world where the machines are quiet. Where children go to school, not to the mill. Where no one dies before 20. The factory looked the same. Same walls, same smoke, same relentless noise. But something had shifted. It had been 3 days since the spinning frame exploded, since James collapsed, and since Alice raised her voice in that deafening silence. Mary had expected punishment, someone fired, someone beaten, someone made an example of. But nothing happened. No words, no warnings. Mr. Griggs returned to his rounds with the same stiff walk and furious glare, but even he seemed cautious now, as if the factory itself had noticed a crack forming in its foundation. Whispers had started. Mary heard them everywhere now, between the clatter of machines behind cupped hands during lunch, murmured by candlelight on the walk home. Names floated through the mill like ghosts. Robert Owen, Lord Ashley, Sadler, Shaftesbury. People who didn't work the machines. People who lived in cities Mary had never seen. But they were writing, speaking, shouting for them, demanding limits on hours, demanding the end of child labor, demanding that workers, even the poorest, be treated like human beings. Of course, the factory owners pushed back. They called it nonsense. They claimed children wanted to work, that it was character building, that if the poor didn't labor, they'd become thieves. Useless. Dangerous. They said machines were progress, and progress demanded sacrifice. But whose sacrifice? Mary looked at the faces around her and saw the answer. She saw Alice working with one hand because her other still throbbed with infection. She saw Eliza, who had started coughing deep, ugly coughs that sounded like tearing cloth. She saw Tommy, the little scavenger boy, his hands shaking from exhaustion, his eyes dull distant, as if he were already leaving this world in pieces. She saw herself, and she was tired of being invisible. The wall begins to buckle. The shift on Thursday started like any other. At 4:30 a.m., the streets were filled with silent figures marching toward the mill, steam already rising from the chimneys like smoke from a battlefield. But at noon, something changed. It began with a girl named Martha, 14 years old, always quiet, always fast. Her foot got caught beneath a crate, and she fell near a moving belt. A scream ripped through the room. Blood spattered across the spinning frame. Her leg was crushed instantly. She would never walk again. The overseer didn't pause. "Clean it up," he barked. No concern, no help, no ambulance, just a command, just filth and silence. But someone didn't obey. Mary stood up. She walked straight to Mr. Griggs and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "She needs a doctor, not a broom." The room froze. Mr. Griggs turned to her eyes like ice. "Go back to your station," he said. "I won't," Mary answered. Her voice trembled. Her knees did too, but she stood. "I won't," echoed Alice, stepping forward. "I won't," said another girl, then a boy, then another. Dozens now. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't violence. It was worse for the factory. It was unity. The power of stillness. For the first time in months, the factory floor was quiet. Not because the machines had broken, but because the people refused to move. No bobbins turned. No frames spun. Just the whistle of steam, the ticking of clocks, the sound of Mary's heart pounding in her chest. Mr. Griggs shouted. He waved his cane. He threatened to fire them all. But there was a power in that silence. A terrifying, beautiful power. For the first time, the workers realized how much the machines needed them. Without hands, the factory was nothing but iron and dust. News spread fast. Not just in Manchester. Across England. More mills joined in. More voices were raised. Some were crushed brutally publicly, but others sparked change. Newspapers began to ask questions. Writers, preachers, even a few members of parliament began to take notice. Suddenly, the lives of factory workers weren't just stories whispered in back alleys. They were headlines, political speeches, public debates. A law isn't enough, but it's a start. In 1833, something happened that changed everything. The Factory Act was passed. It wasn't perfect. Far from it. But it was the first real law to say children shouldn't work more than 48 hours a week. No one under 9 should be in a factory. And factories must allow 2 hours of school a day. Many owners ignored it. Some bribed inspectors. some forged records. But still, something had changed. For the first time, the government admitted what was happening inside those factories was wrong. Mary heard the news from a man on the street reading the paper out loud to a crowd. She didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She just stood there, quietly absorbing the words like drops of rain on dry ground. A law wouldn't bring back James, or fix Martha's leg, or make the air in the mill any cleaner. But it meant someone was finally listening. The machine can be stopped. Years passed. Mary kept working, but something inside her had shifted. She joined a workers' association. She learned to read. She saved every coin she could. She helped teach younger girls how to tie threads safely and how to speak when no one wanted them to. By the time she was 20, the mill looked the same, but Mary didn't. Her voice was stronger, her back straighter, her heart still heavy, but no longer hopeless. She didn't dream of luxury. She dreamed of dignity, of fresh air, a warm meal, a job that didn't kill you slowly, and maybe, just maybe, of a day when children would only see factories in books, not live and die inside them. By the 1840s, the streets of Manchester were changing. New machines, new buildings, new inventions, railways, telegraphs, gas lights. People called it progress. From the outside, the city looked modern, alive. But deep inside its bones, buried under cobblestone and smoke, were names the world had forgotten. Names like James, Martha, Eliza. Children who never got to grow up. Mary never forgot them. Every time she passed the mill, even long after she stopped working there, she saw their shadows in the windows. She heard their coughs in the echo of the bricks. She felt the cold floor beneath her feet and the weight of the spinning frames in her shoulders. The pain never left. Not really. It just grew quieter. Her body still carried the cost. By 35, her lungs were brittle. Her joints cracked when she moved. Some mornings, she couldn't make it down the stairs. Her fingers, once nimble and quick, now curled stiffly like old branches. But Mary was no longer a child. She was a mother, the new generation. Her daughter Clara was born in 1841, the same year that Parliament passed a new Factory Act, this time extending protections to women as well as children. Clara had Mary's sharp eyes and her father's curiosity. She asked questions constantly, even before she could pronounce them properly. Why is the air so dark? Why don't you work at the mill? Mama, why can I go to school, and you never did? Mary didn't know how to answer at first. She didn't want to fill her daughter's head with horror, but she didn't want to lie either. So slowly, carefully, she began to tell Clara the truth. About the cold mornings, about the whistle, about the days without food, about Alice's hand, about the scream when Martha fell. Clara didn't cry. She listened. And then she said, "I'm glad I was born after the law." Mary smiled, but her heart tightened, because she knew the law wasn't enough. It had come too late for too many, and even now, many owners still found ways to break it. But Clara would not enter the factory. That much Mary had promised, not if it meant begging, starving, or working herself to the grave. Clara would read. Clara would learn. Clara would be free. A city divided by memory. Even as the mills modernized and child labor slowly declined, a strange silence settled over the city. The factories still ran, but their darkest years were becoming myth. Employers built cleaner buildings, opened Sunday schools, even paid for hospital wings, trying to wash the blood from their bricks. New managers claimed they had never abused children. They had always cared for their workers. But Mary remembered. The older workers did too. They shared glances in the market nods in the street. They didn't need words. They had lived through something together. Something that could never be fully explained to those who hadn't. Some people said the past should be left behind, that the city was better now, that complaining only stirred up unrest, that the poor should be grateful. But Mary knew better. She'd seen what silence cost. The first union meeting. In 1850, Mary attended her first real meeting of workers. It was held in a church basement, cold, damp, and filled with voices that refused to be quiet any longer. Men and women spoke about wages, housing, safety. They called for shorter work days, better conditions, and schools that actually taught. Some demanded voting rights. Others argued for the right to strike, a radical idea at the time. Mary didn't speak that night. She sat in the back, listening, remembering. But the next meeting she did. She told them about the belt that took Martha's leg, about the overseer who beat children for blinking, about the girl who died at 8, whose name no one even wrote down, about the moment, just a single moment, when they all stood still and refused to move. When she finished, the room was silent, not out of fear, but respect. Her story didn't make the papers. It wasn't quoted in Parliament, but it lived in the room that night, and in those who left with fire in their hearts. Sometimes memory is a form of resistance. Clara grew older, went to school, became a teacher. Mary lived to see her daughter walk through a door she had never been allowed to touch, a library, a place where girls weren't just allowed, but welcomed, where hands were meant for turning pages, not twisting threads. Sometimes Mary walked with Clara down the streets of the city, past the old mill, past the workers' row houses, past the graveyard where so many nameless children rested. She never stopped to cry. She didn't need to. Instead, she pointed to the buildings and said, "That's where I was broken." And then, a few blocks later, she pointed to Clara and said, "And that's where I healed." Because Mary wasn't just a survivor, she was a witness. And that, in the end, was the greatest power she had. The final thought. By the time Mary was an old woman, she no longer feared the sound of a whistle. Factories were changing. Machines were safer. Children were in school. Not everywhere, but more than ever before. Mary still lived with pain. In her joints, in her lungs, in her memories. But she had seen the impossible happen. She had seen the machine pause, and that meant it could change. And change, once it begins, does not stop. She would never be famous. No statue would bear her name. But in every child who went to school, every girl who read a book, instead of tying a thread, every law passed to protect the weak Mary was there. And in every corner of every factory, there would always be echoes of those who dared to say, "We are not machines." There are places in every city where history doesn't rest in books or museums. It lingers in the air, in the brick dust, in the way light filters through broken windows and lands on rusted beams. In Manchester, there is a stretch of road that curves past the river, where the old mills still stand. Some have been converted into apartments, their exposed bricks now lit by soft lamps and quiet laughter. Others have become museums, or silent shells with broken glass and ivy crawling up the walls, like nature slowly reclaiming the forgotten. And if you walk there at dawn, when the city is half asleep, the air still smells faintly of oil and steam, like a memory that refuses to fade. In one of those old buildings just behind a gate that hasn't been locked in decades, lies the factory where Mary once worked. It is no longer filled with machines, no longer echoes with the screams of spinning frames or the whistle that once dictated life. Now it is still. But if you listen, really listen, you can hear something. Not the noise of progress, but the breathing of history. The breath of girls who stood for 14 hours with bleeding fingers. of boys who crawled beneath moving gears before they were tall enough to look out a window, of mothers who sent their children into the mill because there was no other choice, and of children who never came home. Time has a way of polishing pain into symbols. There are plaques, now bronze signs, that say things like, "This mill once powered the British Empire," or site of early industrial innovation. The word innovation shines bright on brochures, but the word suffering is harder to engrave. There is no statue of Mary, no public square named after James or Martha or Eliza, no candle burns for the unnamed, and yet their legacy is deeper than marble. Because what they gave the world wasn't just cloth or profit. It was the slow, painful birth of conscience. The realization that progress without humanity is just machinery. That speed without care is violence. That children should never be turned into parts of a system, but protected from its sharpest teeth. And perhaps, most importantly, that silence is dangerous. That when people look away, abuse thrives. Mary's name was never recorded in the official ledgers. She never led a march or wrote a speech. But she did something harder. She endured. She stood her ground when it was forbidden. She spoke when it was dangerous. She passed on knowledge not just to her daughter, but to the world that came after. That's what resistance sometimes looks like, not shouting in the streets, but refusing to be erased. Simply surviving in a place designed to break you is itself a revolution. The children of the Industrial Revolution didn't dream of wealth. They dreamed of breathing clean air, of walking without pain, of going home before dark. Their dreams were small because the world had made them small. But those small dreams piled up one on top of another until they became something too big to ignore. Laws changed, schooling expanded, workdays shortened, inspections were created, reformers unionists, activists. They carried the torch, but the fire was lit long before in the hearts of nameless workers who refused to become cogs. And today, as modern factories run with fluorescent lights, safety manuals, and child labor laws, something those 19th century workers never knew, a different kind of question lingers in the air. Do we still remember? Because forgetting is easy in comfort. It is easy to marvel at technology and forget the hands that once bled to feed its hunger. It is easy to celebrate industrial heritage while ignoring the childhoods it consumed. But the factory still stands, and beneath its floorboards is an echo, the sound of footsteps before sunrise, of children tying threads with trembling hands, of a girl standing up and saying, "I won't." That echo is our inheritance. So when we walk past these places, when we touch old bricks, or read those plaques, or hear the soft hum of progress, we should pause. Not in guilt, but in recognition. Not because we owe them pity, but because we owe them memory. And memory, when it's shared truthfully, becomes more than reflection. It becomes resistance. The next time you hear the word progress, remember Mary. Remember the whistle in the dark. Remember the hands that built the modern world and paid for it with their childhoods. And above all, remember that history doesn't end in the past. It lives in the choices we make now. Because there are still factories in the world, still children, still silence, and someone somewhere still needs to be the first to stand up and say, "This isn't right." And when they do, may they know that they are not alone. There comes a moment in every story when the noise fades. When the machines stop turning, the factory doors close for good, and the world outside moves on. Time buries buildings, repaints cities, rebrands struggle into heritage. The soot-stained windows of the cotton mills eventually gave way to polished glass offices. The smell of oil and sweat was replaced by the scent of coffee and fresh paint. What was once a battlefield of class and survival became a tourist district. Brick walls, preserved not for protection, but for atmosphere. And yet, for those who lived through it, for those like Mary, the silence that followed was louder than the factory ever was. It didn't come all at once. For decades after Mary's time, the mills continued to operate in some form. The laws improved little by little. Minimum ages were raised. Workdays reduced education required. But these things didn't erase the damage. They only prevented it from continuing, which was not the same as healing. The scars remained in bodies and memory, in the way certain families still walked past those old buildings without looking up. Because to look was to remember, and to remember was to feel the ache all over again. Mary grew old. Not many of her generation did. Her joints stiffened with the kind of pain that no doctor could cure. Her breathing slowed each inhale like drawing through cloth. Her eyesight dimmed, but her mind stayed sharp. She read when she could, listened when she couldn't. And in her final years, she became something rare in her world, a witness who survived long enough to tell the story. She told it not with bitterness, but with clarity. Not to shame, but to teach. To her grandchildren, she described the machines not just what they did, but what they took. She explained what it meant to work 14 hours a day before you were tall enough to reach a windowsill. She spoke of names they would never read in books Eliza Tommy June, and made sure their lives were not reduced to a line in a report or a statistic in a museum. And when her breath grew too weak to carry words, she passed the story on in quieter ways. In a look, in a touch. In the way she never wasted a single scrap of fabric. In the way she sat still every evening at 5:00 p.m., the time the whistle used to blow until one day it no longer came. When Mary passed, there was no newspaper headline, no parade. But her daughter Clara placed a small note inside her mother's hand, written in careful, determined script. You were the thread that held us together. And that was the truth. Because while machines built the wealth of an empire, it was the hands of people like Mary that kept the threads from breaking. Their labor, exploited, silent, uncelebrated, was the foundation upon which generations would build freedom, education, and dignity. And that truth should never be forgotten. Magerview. Now, in the present day, school children walk past the old mills on their way to classes. Their backpacks are filled with books instead of tools. Their fingers tap phone screens, not spinning frames. They do not fear whistles in the morning. They do not sleep with the taste of cotton dust in their mouths. And most of them, perhaps understandably, do not know the names of the children who gave them that future. But once in a while, a teacher stops their class outside an old factory. They point to the bricks. They tell them of a time when children their age were already years into a life of labor. When girls stood for hours with open wounds wrapped in rags. When boys cleaned beneath grinding gears with only prayer to keep them safe. And maybe, just maybe, one of those children listens. Really listens. They imagine the sound of 1,000 machines roaring. The heat, the blood, the ache. The way the world once believed this was normal, necessary, natural. And they carry that knowledge into their lives not as guilt, but as awareness. Because that is the true inheritance of history. Not shame, but vigilance. To remember that injustice once allowed to settle becomes routine. That progress without memory is fragile. And that every generation has its own machines, less visible perhaps, but no less demanding. Factories today don't always run on steam. Sometimes they run on silence, on digital exhaustion, on economic desperation. But somewhere, someone still hears the whistle. Somewhere, someone still walks to work in the dark. And somewhere else, someone is choosing whether to speak or stay quiet. May they know that silence is not safety, that every right we have came from someone who stood up when it was hard. that even the smallest resistance, the refusal to accept suffering as normal, can change the course of the world. And may they remember Mary, the girl who tied threads, the woman who bore scars, the voice that rose quiet but unwavering in a room of spinning steel. The machines have stopped, but the story is still turning, and it's ours now to carry. There is a quiet kind of extinction that doesn't come from war or plague or fire. It comes from forgetting. From the slow erosion of memory under the pressure of comfort distraction and modern convenience. The kind that replaces lived suffering with textbook timelines, smooth museum glass, and guided tours that sanitize everything but the bricks. The factory still stands, but its ghosts are harder to see. The soot has been scrubbed from the windows. The wheels no longer turn. The air smells of coffee and fresh paint, not grease and sweat. And the people who walk through those spaces, now artists, tech workers, tourists, walk gently with soft shoes and uncalloused hands. They run fingers along brick walls where once blood had dried. They take photographs in front of rusted machines without ever knowing what those machines once demanded from the people who fed them. There is no crime in that. Time must move forward. Cities must change. But when we forget who paid for the progress, we risk repeating the price. Every right we hold today, the 5-day work week, the 8-hour day, the right to go to school instead of a factory, was not handed down from the heavens. It was won. With voices hoarse from steam-choked lungs, with hands blistered from tying threads in silence, with bones broken under weight that never should have been theirs to carry, and too often with the lives of children who didn't live long enough to know the freedom they died for. Mary didn't fight in a war. She didn't lead a rebellion. She didn't write a manifesto. She simply endured what most people today could not imagine: the cruelty of being born into a machine that saw her not as a girl, but as a gear. Her resistance was in her survival, in her refusal to be broken completely, in the way she passed on her story not as bitterness, but as warning, as truth, as torchlight for those walking behind her. But even torchlight can be swallowed by time. And so we must choose. We can let her story drift away, filed under industrial era, and checked off in a school exam. Or we can choose to carry it, to tell it, to feel it, to teach it. Not because we wish to drown in the sadness of history, but because only by knowing what darkness we come from can we understand how far we've truly come, and how much farther we still must go. Because even now, in places not so far from here, there are children working when they should be learning. Women laboring in factories with no ventilation, no breaks, no choice. Young workers tied not to spinning frames, but to gig apps, digital deadlines, and algorithmic masters who never sleep. The machines have changed. The exploitation hasn't. So let Mary's life echo not as tragedy, but as question. What kind of world do we build when we pretend the old world never existed? Who are we if we benefit from the sacrifices of the past, but refuse to carry the burden of remembering them? And what becomes of our humanity if we treat justice as something inherited instead of something constantly fought for? If you ever find yourself walking past an old brick building, one with high windows and iron doors, stop, look up, breathe in, and imagine. Imagine waking there before the sun, your hands still bleeding from yesterday. Imagine tying thread after thread, each one a piece of your own childhood unraveling. Imagine someone telling you it was your duty, your lot, your fate. And then imagine the moment you whispered no, and it changed everything. Because someone once did exactly that. And that someone wasn't special. She wasn't rich. She wasn't powerful. She was ordinary. And in being ordinary, she showed us the extraordinary power of dignity. So don't forget her. Don't forget any of them. Remember the whistle, the dust, the silence that screamed louder than machines. Remember Mary, not because her story is unique, but because it isn't. Sometimes, history doesn't feel like a story, it feels like a wound. Not because it bleeds anymore, but because it aches when the air changes, when the light hits the memory just right. And in those moments, we're reminded that the past is not buried. It's merely waiting to be remembered. The factory still stands, though its name has changed. The machines are gone. Their noise replaced by the click of keyboards or the soft hum of curated music from hidden speakers. The ceilings are high, the floors polished, the walls repainted in warm tones to attract tenants. But beneath that fresh coat of respectability lies something older, something much heavier. The silence of 1,000 untold stories pressed into the grain of the wood. And if you stand still enough, if you press your palm to the wall and close your eyes, you might hear it. Not words, but the rhythm of forgotten labor, the whisper of threads being tied by trembling hands, the whistle at 5:00 a.m., cutting through dreams, the quiet determination of a girl who wouldn't look away when another child fell. Mary has long returned to the earth. So have Alice and Eliza and James and Tommy. The people who built the industrial world didn't do it from behind desks or through blueprints. They did it with their backs and lungs and skin. Their names were not recorded in company archives. Their stories were not carved into stone. But the world they helped shape still moves forward with their fingerprints pressed into its foundation. The bridges, the trains, the ships, the roads. Every piece of modern infrastructure carries somewhere deep within it the echo of those who made them possible. And what of the children? The ones like Clara, who were born just late enough to be saved by the courage of those before them. They became teachers, doctors, artists, reformers. They built schools instead of factories. They wrote books instead of time cards. They carried quietly, and often unknowingly, the weight of their ancestors' labor like an invisible inheritance. And that, too, is part of the legacy. That a girl who once tied threads by candlelight gave birth to a woman who lit the minds of future generations. But as time passed, the story of Mary and her generation risked something worse than pain. It risked becoming irrelevant. We are taught that the past is over, that the fight is finished, that the laws now protect us, and the worst is behind us. But what we forget is that laws are only words, and words fade unless they are constantly defended. That cruelty, when not checked, simply finds new names outsourcing efficiency flexibility. That today's world. And so, as the factory grows quiet and the lights go out, we leave behind more than just a building. We leave behind the pain, the endurance, and the quiet strength of a generation that never got to write its own story, but gave us the right to write ours. The Industrial Revolution changed the world. But behind the inventions, the smokestacks, and the empire building were children, mothers, ordinary people like Mary, who asked for nothing but dignity and gave everything to make sure others could have it. If this story moved you, if it made you think, remember, or simply breathe a little deeper, then I invite you to stay with us. Here on Snoozy Historian, we don't rush through history. We wander through it slowly, softly, one story at a time. Stories to sleep to. Stories to feel. Stories that deserve to be told with care. So if you believe that history isn't just dates and battles, but people, emotions, lives lived in quiet resistance, then this is your place. Subscribe. Stay a while, and let's keep remembering together. Thank you for watching. Sleep well, and never forget.